Heroes of the Faith. And this week we're talking about Abraham, and still using for study guide the, I didn't bring the book with me tonight, but the book by Brother Bill Kay. I'm not going to try to pronounce his last name. You all know who I'm talking about. Unleash Your Faith. And so this is another very good lesson. And hopefully there's something in it for all of us. I know there was things that really stood out to me in this chapter, and so I'll read here the section in Hebrews on Abraham, and then we'll turn back and look at the story, his beginning in Genesis. But Hebrews 11 verse 8, and this is the New King James Version. It says, "By faith Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to the place which he would receive as an inheritance. And he went out, not knowing where he was going. By faith he dwelt in the land of promise, as in a foreign country, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, the heirs with him of the same promise. For he waited for the city which has foundations, whose builder and maker is God." And the other verse that talks about Abraham is there, verse 17. I'll just go ahead and read it because he covers some of that story too. He says, "By faith Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises offered up his only begotten son, of whom it was said, In Isaac shall your seed be called, concluding that God was able to raise him up even from the dead, from which he also received him in a figurative sense." And so if you think about Abraham, who's first called Abram, he was considered by many as the greatest example of faith, or the greatest pilgrim in the Old Testament. Here Hebrews says that he was called from his home. He went out not knowing where he was going. They didn't build houses where they went. They lived in tents. They were on the move. They didn't settle down. They were waiting for God to move and to lead them to where he needed to be. He was called the father of the faith, or father of the faithful. And if you want to read in Romans, I forgot that I didn't write down the chapter, but Paul in Romans chooses Abraham to talk about faith and the father of faith, the faithful. That's where you can kind of read some of that in the New Testament. But we know that Abraham was the man through whom God made a covenant. He promised him that through him, all the people of the earth would be blessed. And there were some other promises that went along with that. We'll kind of cover those. But here Brother Bill says that Abraham believed God, he feared God, and he obeyed God. And we'll see that, down through his life. And the greatest mark, he says, is that in Abraham's life was his unshakable faith in God. The Bible says that simply that he believed God, and that was counted to him for righteousness. And the second high mark in his life was his unquestionable obedience to God. He never asked God why, but Brother Bill says that he blindly and readily followed God in what he asked him to do. And it is in Abraham that we see more than in anyone else how faith in God behaves. And I really like this. He says, it falls in the dark and it fully relies on him. Faith in God makes some hard requests, especially those moments when there is no light to follow and nothing in sight. And that's what when you look at Abraham's story in the beginning, put yourself in his shoes. God said, I want you to go. I want you to leave your home, leave your family. I want you to go to this land, but not really much instruction, not really much promise yet of what there was to come. Let's go over there and read that before we get ahead of ourselves. In Genesis, the 12th chapter, is when the promises begin. And let me point out too that his family had settled in a land. I think, from what I understand, they were headed to the land that God sent Abraham, but they kind of stopped and they kind of parked, and they lived there. They dwelled there. They weren't just pilgrims. They weren't passing through. They set up homestead there, so to speak. But God says to Abraham, "I don't want you to stay there." It was a land where false gods were worshipped. But God spoke to Abraham and said, "Get out of your country, from your family, from your father's house, to a land that I will show you. And I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great. And you shall be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse him who curses you. And in you all families of the earth shall be blessed." And we've got to remember that Abraham, well, here he's Abram. I always get that. I went to school with an Abram, and so sometimes it's hard. You want to call him Abraham too early, but it was Abram then. He departed as the Lord had spoken to him, and Lot went with him. It says that he was 75 years old when he departed from Haran, departed from his family, took Sarah, his wife, Lot, his brother's son, gathered all they had, it says, and they went to go to the land of Canaan. And it says there in verse 7, the Lord appeared to Abram and said, "To your descendants will I give this land." And there he built an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him. And as it says there, he moved from there to the mountains east of Bethel, and he pitched his tent with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. And there he built an altar to the Lord and called on the name of the Lord. So Abraham journeyed, going on still towards the south. And I think it's interesting here, and I had this note at the end, but I'll point it out here since we just read that. I think it's a show of Abraham's faith too, or testament to his faith. Everywhere that Abram went, he built an altar to the Lord. And that just really stood out to me because, that altar, that is a place of sacrifice. That is a place of faith. That is a place where we lay down ourselves and our will and our desires and our comforts to be able to follow God and to trust him and increase our faith as we follow God. I'm trying not to get ahead of myself. But I thought that was a very, very interesting point that I ran across. But going back here, it says faith in God makes some hard requests. And we're going to talk about some of those hard requests. But it follows in the dark and fully relies on God. And if you remember, when were the times that Abram ran into trouble? It was when he didn't rely on his faith in God. He took matters into his own hands. With Sarah, his wife, she was a beautiful woman. He was afraid that the people in Egypt and whatever the other country was would want to take her. So he said, "She's my sister," which there was some truth in that. Technically, he was. They were half brother and sister, which wasn't uncommon in that time. But that brought some problems. There was about to be a plague on the Egyptian people, and they said, "What in the world are you doing to us? You trying to bring the wrath of God on us by telling us that your wife is your sister?" And then another biggie. He, with the help of Sarah, took matters into his own hands when they didn't have a son. God said, "I'm going to give you a son. I'm going to make of you a great nation," but it just wasn't happening fast enough for them. So here, Sarah says, "You take my handmaid, take my servant," and Hagar bore a son named Ishmael. But that wasn't the son of promise. And it caused a lot of heartache and a lot of headache down the road for Hagar and Ishmael, and even for Abraham. You all know that story. But anytime Abram got ahead of God, there was trouble. But if you look at Abraham's life, this is like a summary here of the faith revealed in his life. We kind of covered some of it already, but to give us a little overview before we get into the rest of the lesson, it says that he leaves home not knowing where he's going. He believes and follows God in response to this call. He sacrifices his rights and privileges in his relationship with Lot, relying fully on God, saying, "You choose which way to go." We'll talk about that story more. He rescues Lot and Lot's family along with others, saving them from destruction, but refusing any reward from the king of Sodom. He pays his tithe to Melchizedek, recognizing God's right to all that he possesses, also expressing his faithfulness and obedience. He intercedes passionately for the righteous in the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. He takes the step of faith to sacrifice his son with faith that God would restore him back, which God did. He sends his servant to secure a wife for Isaac, having the faith that God had already selected her for him. And those are interesting stories to go back and read if you want to read more about the life of Abraham. But that's just a few of the situations and things that in his life to illustrate his faith. But I really like this point here. It says that it was faith that enabled Abraham to look into the future and see the promise of God as a present reality. Now, that really stood out to me. Faith that enabled him to look into the future and see the promise of God as a present reality. That's kind of hard to do, but that's what he did. It was the faith in God that guided him in the midst of the tests and perplexities that he experienced in his life. Just like he told Lot when they came to that time of trouble, he said, "You take what you want." And at the mountain with Isaac, he said, "The Lord will provide." When he responded to the questions of the servant, he said, "The Lord, the God of heaven, will send his angel before you so that you can get a wife for my son." Abraham saw, with faith, he was able to see the promises of God as a present reality. Those things hadn't happened yet. Just like he was an old man. He was 75 years old when he left his home. He didn't have an heir. He didn't have a son to pass down. He didn't have a son that would be able to father nations as God had promised him. His wife was old. She was beyond childbearing years. She was barren in her life. But that didn't deter Abraham's faith. He believed God, even though he hadn't seen it yet, even though it wasn't a present reality. He believed and he trusted God that these things were going to happen as if it were a present reality. And I really like these points that he has here, that it was in Abraham we see the calmness of faith. And, there is a peace in faith. When we trust God, as the New Testament says, it's a peace that passes all understanding. It's something that we can't explain or we can't really understand. Ordinarily, it wouldn't be a situation where there would be peace. It would be turmoil. It would be grief or sorrow or whatever the situation is. But in faith, there is a calmness. And then also it says in Abraham we see the courage of faith. The courage that he would so willingly and so readily leave his home and leave his family behind to follow God's call. The same thing is available for us. Do we have the courage of faith that we would move when God calls? that we would go where God says to go, that we would do what God is asking for us to do. He says that there is clear vision of faith, and we're going to talk about that in Abraham's life here in a minute. But faith helps us to see more clearly the call that God has for us and what His desire is for us. And then there is the commitment of faith. Abraham was faithful throughout his life. He was, as I said, always building altars wherever he went. His commitment was to God. He trusted God. And so we're going to look here and see how the vision and the guidance of faith shaped and determined the direction of Abraham's life, but also how it can shape the direction of our lives. And the first thing Brother Bill here says is that Abraham's faith enabled him to get a clear vision of God's call and God's direction for his life, so that he willingly detached himself from his place, from his people, from his father, and he brought him from Ur of the Chaldeans near Babylon to Haran in Mesopotamia, and that's between the rivers Tigris and Euphrates. And he kind of goes into that same history we mentioned earlier, that the original goal of Terah, his father, was to get to the land of Canaan, but they kind of stopped partway, and they kind of forgot the goal. And the same thing kind of happens to us sometimes. Some people start on the way, or start towards the goal, but they never finish. They never get to where they're going. They might compromise, conform, and as a result, lose sight of the goal. And that's kind of what happened, he indicates here with Terah. Some people start out with Christ, but then settle for something less. Some people start into ministry, but then they conform to something else. And, he reminds us of a verse that Jesus said, if you put your hand to the plow, don't look back. After Abraham's father died, it was after Abraham's father died that God came to Abraham and gave him these promises. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all the peoples of the earth will be blessed through you. And Abraham was 75 years old when that happened. But notice that faith detaches itself from the familiar and the secure, and attaches itself to God and His promises. And this is, I think, a very important verse in my mind. Think about that detachment. It detaches itself from the familiar and the secure. The word that I use is, it gets us out of our comfort zone. A place that's familiar to us, it's comfortable, it's a little easy. But he says if we want to fulfill the plan of God, experience His power, feel His presence, and experience the fulfillment of His promises, we must, by faith, detach ourselves from the things that bind us. What's holding us back? What's keeping us bound? What's holding on to us? Our attachment to certain things renders us unable to fully serve God. But faith, on the other hand, helps us to detach from self-seeking, from places, from people that hold us captive, that hold us back. He says by faith we can become detached from the spirit of complacency, the spirit of apathy, and the spirit of compromise. And it's faith that helps us break loose, to follow God, to do His will, and to go where He calls us to serve. And I'm not going to read that all again, but I hope you all caught that, because I think that's really important. Faith is what helps us detach from those things that hold us back, that keep us comfortable, that keep us feeling complacent, or apathetic, and it helps us, faith helps us break loose from those things so that we can follow God, that we can do His will, and we can serve Him fully. The next thing is that Abraham's faith enabled him to see. It guided him in knowing what to surrender and when to surrender it to God. Faith enabled him to rely heavily on God. And this is the story of Lot, where on their journey, Brother Bill calls Lot a burden, which he kind of was. They had amassed great possessions between them, and when they came back from Egypt, there was no room for everybody. There wasn't enough room for all the flocks and all the people, and so the servants of Lot and the servants of Abraham were quarreling back and forth. And in this situation, you see the greatness of Abraham in his faith, because he calls Lot in and he says, "Listen, let there be no quarreling among us or between you and me. We're brothers." And Brother B points out, would to God that we had such wisdom when troubles appear in our homes and churches. And that's great wisdom there. We need to come together in these times. But he says, Abraham said, "Lift up your eyes and choose. If you go to the left, I'll go to the right. If you go west, I will go east. But let there be no quarrel among us." Abraham had the right to choose. He was the elder. He could have chosen whatever he saw fit. But he saw further than the physical eye could see. He surrendered the right to choose because he was confident that God had already made the choice for him. And choice is a delicate part, he says, of our journey of faith. There are those who choose to run their lives, and there are others who by faith surrender to God. And you think about that, sometimes it's hard for us to surrender. Sometimes it's hard to let go of control. We think if we let go, what's going to happen? And we kind of want to keep holding on. But faith is the surrender to God. There are those who choose to live with their problems. And then there are those who choose by faith to see things God's way, and as a result, they surrender their problems to God. Faith leaves the choosing to God. As that old song says, His way is best. I will not murmur. Abraham left the choice to God, and the same is true in our lives. If we leave the choice to God, His way will be best, but we've got to surrender our need for control, surrender our need and desire for comfort in what appears to be easy. But of course, you all know the story that Lot looked and saw the valley of Jordan, beautiful, prosperous land near Sodom and Gomorrah. He said, I'll go that way. Little did he know that his choice was going to be the most painful experience of his life. He didn't gain anything. He lost it all. He lost his family. He lost his possessions. He lost what he had. On the other hand, Abraham believed. He surrendered his rights and allowed God to make his choice. So the question for us is, do we allow God to choose for us? Is God free to choose our mate? Is He free to choose our employment? Is He free to choose where we live? Is He free to choose our friends? Those are some things to really think about. When Abraham had surrendered his rights, this is what God has said to him. He says, "Lift up your eyes. As far as you can see," he said, "it will be yours." The response to Abraham was the promise of God to build, the response of Abraham, again, was to build an altar and worship God. Because God's choice is always best. The third thing is that Abraham's faith enabled him to see beyond the offering, see beyond the coming blessing, and thus find guidance in the midst of conflicting interests and emotions. Now we come to the time of Abraham's biggest test. His faith, his love, his loyalty, all face testing. God had blessed him with a son at 100 years old. And as a grown boy, he was now Abraham's only heir. Yet God said to him, take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on the mountain I will show you. What a request. How do you do that? How do you sacrifice your only son? It seems, though, that Abraham had such a relationship with God that he believed and trusted, fully loving God and totally relying on his faithfulness. Abraham didn't even ask any questions. He just believed God. And he believed that God was going to give back his son. That's what our verse here in Hebrews says. Even though his faith was tested in this way, he says in verse 19, he concluded that God was able to raise him up even from the dead, which he also received him in a figurative sense. He believed that even if he did sacrifice his son, that's the son through whom God said these promises would be fulfilled. God will raise him from the dead. And that is faith. Faith offers the best. Faith causes us to offer the dearest, nearest, and the greatest because it believes God. As Abraham prepared for the journey, we know that he took some servants and had some donkeys carrying the wood. And as he approached the place, he told the servants to stay, and he took Isaac with him to the place of sacrifice. And Abraham, you can picture him preparing the altar. And Isaac looked up and he said, Dad, everything is ready, but where's the sacrifice? What did Abraham say? The Lord will provide. We can be pushed to the limit. We can come to the end of our rope, and someone would tell us that there's no hope. Just curse God and die, just like Job's wife would say. But if our faith is fixed on God and we act on his word, he will provide. God always provides. He makes a way in the wilderness. Now, with confidence, Abraham ties Isaac on the altar. He raises his hand to take his son's life, but God steps in just in time. He says, Abraham, don't harm the child. I've seen your faith. The scripture tells us that he took his son back symbolically, and that's here, and that's what he was talking about here in Hebrews, that he took him back in a figurative sense. And even though we know that Isaac represents Jesus Christ, who gave his life on the cross for our redemption, that's kind of a hard story sometimes to read about and to think about. How could God ask such a thing? How could God test a man in such a way? But Abraham's faith never wavered. He never doubted. He was never shaken. He was firm. God will provide. And so faith, with its vision and providential guidance, empowers us to disconnect from our hindrances, surrender our rights, and fully rely on the God who always works for our best. So then he asked the question, what about your faith? You know, it says here that in Hebrews verse 13 that these all died in the faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them afar off. The promises that were given to Abraham were still coming to fruition. He didn't get to see the end result. He didn't get to see the greatness that it would become, that it was pointing not to his physical seed, his physical family, a physical nation, but ultimately to the spiritual nation, to the through Jesus Christ. Just like here, his son Isaac, the genealogy all through leads up to Jesus Christ, who through him, it says, all nations now of the earth are blessed. It's in Jesus Christ is that seed that it was pointing to. So Abraham didn't even get to see that full fruition, completion of his faith. But there's some other questions that, I thought about whenever I was reading this. If you think for yourself, when God calls us, or when God asks us to do something, are we willing to step out of our comfort zone? Are we willing to step out in faith to do what God has called us to do? It's at the end of our comfort zone that God can truly work. It's at the end of ourselves. And that's why I think the need is, as he talked about, to detach, to let go of those things that would cause a hindrance in our lives, that would hinder us from doing God's will, for completing God's call, from obeying the will of God for your life. Detach yourself from those things that would hold you back. As Brother Bradley can always say, whatever you're thinking about, that's what I'm talking about. But you just think for yourself and in your own mind. Are there things that God is calling you to do, but you're kind of, I don't know if I can do that. I don't know if that's what God's really saying. I don't know if I should do that. I'm not really prepared. I'm not really ready. It's at that time, at that crossroads, just like Abraham. Are you willing to take that step in faith? Out of that comfort zone, out of that fear, letting go, as we said, of their need for control, or letting go of that fear, and instead stepping out in faith. Get back here too. And just like Abraham's life, sometimes it's easy for us to get ahead of God, and sometimes that'll cause us trouble, just like it did for Abraham. They tried to step in and help God out, but God doesn't need our help. He's got it under control, so let Him have control. And